Mandatory Incident Report. Vessel Orindal Reach Registry CTV 77 Foreign filed by Revik Solm, Cargo Manifest Specialist, Grade 3 Incident Period. Transit Day 19 through Transit Day 31. Tarath Corridor Run Classification. Crew Conduct Asset Handling. Diplomatic Protocol. I want to be clear from the start that I am not a handler. I have no certification in large predator management, no coursework in Sorath behavioral systems, and no diplomatic clearance of any kind. I am a manifest specialist. My job is to know where things are and to make sure the numbers match. I am telling you this not to deflect responsibility, but because as I think it matters to understanding how everything happened, and I was told to write this account in full, and that it would be reviewed at the highest level, so I am writing it in full. I will try to be accurate. The Orindal Reach departed Tessavar Hub on the morning of Transit Day 1 with a full cargo. Manifest, a crew of 31 and 2 juvenile Sorath in the aft livestock module. The Sorath were registered as diplomatic assets under the Tarath Corridor Treaty, assigned a handler, a man named Paras Dunv, certified level 4, who had apparently worked with Sorath before and knew what he was doing. The manifest listed them as Sorath Ju V02, paired breeding age females, names Naeth and Kor, property of the Sorath Diplomatic Assembly, being transported to Tarath Station for a formal exchange ceremony. I know all of this now. At the time I boarded, I knew only that there was a line on my manifest that read live cargoes restricted. Do not approach. Without cert, and that the module was in the aft section where I rarely had reason to go. I filed my numbers. I did my job. Paras Dunvi died on Transit Day 5. It was not dramatic. He had a cardiac episode in his bunk, the ship's medical officer responded, and he was gone before the end of the watch. I did not know him well. He was a quiet man who ate quickly and retired early and occasionally asked me questions about manifest tracking that suggested he didn't entirely trust the ship's cargo systems, which is fair because neither do I. He was 62 years old and had 7 grandchildren and had been making this particular run for the better part of a decade. I am sorry he died. He deserved to finish the run. What he left behind was a logistics problem. The Orindal Reach had no backup handler. The Sorath were not optional cargo. They were treaty cargo, which meant we could not divert, could not delay, and could not simply lock the module and ignore it for the remaining 26 days. The ship's captain, Tarath Solarn, called a briefing on Transit Day 6. I attended because I attend all cargo briefings. She explained the situation in the flat, clipped way she explained all situations, and then she looked around the room. Cargo Supervisor Dren Osal spoke first. He said the module should be sealed, the Sorath given automated water and ration dispensers, and the problem deferred until Tarath Station. He said this was a handler problem and not a ship problem. This asset classification was clear, and the crew was not obligated to fill in for a dead contractor. He said all of this with the particular authority of a man who has said reasonable-sounding things for many years and has learned that volume and confidence carry you through the parts where the reasoning gets thin. Captain Solarn listened to him. She has the quality of seeming to listen to everyone completely, and then saying whatever she was going to say anyway. She said the automated dispensers were on Dunv's certification card, and she didn't have the access codes. She said the Sorath had already seen 2 days without a feeding, and she wasn't going to hand over 2 dying diplomatic assets to the Tarath envoys. She said someone was going to go in there and feed them, and it was going to happen today, and she was taking volunteers. There were no volunteers. I am not entirely sure why I raised my hand. I have thought about it a great deal in the intervening weeks. The honest answer is that I had children once, and I knew what it felt like when something was hungry, and nobody was doing anything about it. That is the honest answer. It is not a particularly heroic one. Captain Solarn looked at me for a moment. She asked if I had any predator handling experience. I told her I'd once kept a dog. She told me to take the emergency kit from Dunv's quarters and go read everything in it before the next watch. I did. Sorath are not what I expected. I had seen images the way everyone has seen images. They are striking animals. Amber bronze striped coat over a heavy, deep-chested frame, roughly the mass of a young lioness except more solidly built, carrying more weight in the shoulders. The face is broader than a feline's, the jaw more powerful, and there is a ruff of fine sensory quills along the spine from the base of the skull to mid-back that lay flat when the animal is calm and rise when it is alert. The eyes are amber gold with a ring of cobalt pigment around the iris that catches light in a way that looks almost manufactured. The front dew claws are retractable and roughly 6 inches when extended. Dun's notes described them at juvenile stage as being approximately 30 months old, which in Sorath development corresponds to something between a late adolescent and a young adult. Physically capable of most adult behaviors, still socially forming. His notes had a great many other things in them too, and I read all of them, and by the end was sitting on the edge of my bunk, with the kit in my lap and the light in my cabin, doing that thing it does when you've been reading for 3 hours without looking up. 2 things stood out. First, Sorath do not recognize authority through credentials. They recognize it through behavior and scent, and, this was Dunvee's word, through something he called presence, which he defined in a margin note as the quality of moving through a space, as though you have the right to be there. He said certifications are for humans. Sorath don't read paper. Second, Sorath juveniles in a bonding phase, which begins at roughly 20 to 30 months and lasts 6 to 8 months, are actively seeking a social anchor. They are looking for a pack structure. They are, in Dunvee's words, recruiting. He had kept his notes carefully, methodically, and in the section on bonding behavior, he had underlined one sentence twice. The juvenile Sorath does not wait to be chosen, it chooses. I put the notes back in the kit, got up, and went to the aft module. I will not pretend I was not frightened. The module door is heavy plate with a viewport, and when I looked through it before keying the override, both Sorath were visible. Naeth was near the back wall, watching the door. Kor was in the center of the module floor, lying down but with her head up. They were both looking at the viewport. They had heard me walking down the corridor. The corridor itself was worth noting. It was the standard livestock section of a mid-haul barge, low overhead, utility plating on the walls, strip lighting that threw no shadow. The module door had scuff marks along the lower edge from a previous cargo run. The locking mechanism had a small caution placard that someone had put up at some point, and that had begun to peel at the corner. This is the kind of detail I notice because it is my job to notice the state of the ship's cargo infrastructure. I notice it now because I remember standing in that corridor and looking at the peeling placard and thinking that Dunvee would have replaced it, and that his methodical attention to small things was written in the margins of every page of his notes, and that I owed him a clean job. I stood there for a moment. Then I thought about what Dunvee had written, the part about moving as though you have the right to be there, and I thought that the best I could do was try to mean it. I'm not a soldier. I don't have a fighter's habit of settling before I act, but I am a cargo specialist, and I have walked into a great many spaces full of things that could go wrong. And the thing I have learned from that is that the space doesn't know you're nervous unless you show it. I squared my shoulders. I keyed the override. I walked in. Kor was on her feet before the door finished cycling. She covered the distance between us in the time it takes to exhale. She stopped 3 feet in front of me and put her nose to the air and held very still, reading me. I held still too. I had the feeding kit in one hand, 2 sealed protein containers, the kind Dunvee's notes said to use for juveniles, and I was aware that my heart was doing something interesting, but I kept my hands level and my breathing even, and I looked at the space between her ears rather than directly into her eyes, which Dunvee's notes had said was a reasonable middle position. She read me for a long time. Kor was, I would learn, a thorough investigator. She committed to the process. She worked from the top of the kit bag down to my feet, cataloging me in segments, and when she reached my boots she circled to my left side and continued from there. She was close enough that I could see the individual quills lying flat along her spine. They were finer than I had expected, more like stiffened hair than true quills, and they caught the overhead light when she moved. Her eyes were extraordinary. The cobalt ring looked, up close, less like a pigmentation layer and more like something luminescent, something that ran through the structure of the iris rather than sitting on top of it. When she moved and the angle changed, the ring caught light and held it. She read me for a long time. Then she sneezed, which I later learned is a Sorath gesture of neutrality. Not welcome, not rejection, just, I see you, I have no opinion yet. Naeth stayed by the back wall and watched. She didn't approach. She was, I would come to understand, the more deliberate of the two. Kor was forward and fast and decided things quickly. Naeth watched first. Naeth, when she eventually moved, always seemed to have already decided where she was going before her feet started. I put the containers down in the feeding area. I stepped back. I waited. Kor went to the containers immediately. Naeth waited another full minute, watching me while Kor ate, and then she crossed the module and ate too. She was slower about it. She ate with the focused, methodical attention of an animal that does not rush. Dunphy's notes had a line about this. He had written that Neath was the tactical thinker of the pair, that Cor gave you her answer quickly, and Neath gave you the right answer, and that the two of them together were considerably more capable than either alone. I stood there until they were done. Then I collected the empty containers and left. That is the factual account of the first feeding. What happened next is harder to document precisely, but I will try. On transit day 7, I went back for the second feeding. Cor was at the door when I arrived, not at the viewport, at the door, sitting on the other side of it, which I could tell because I could hear her. There is a sound a Sorath makes that Dunphy's notes described as an idle contact call, a low, intermittent rumble, not quite a purr, more like the sound a ship makes when the engines are running well and you've stopped noticing them. She was doing that when I keyed the override. She stepped back to let me in. Neath was still at the back. I did the feeding. Neath ate quickly and went back to the rear. Cor followed me to the door when I left, and I heard the contact call for another few seconds after the door closed. Transit day 8. Cor again at the door. Neath crossed to me before I finished setting out the containers. She moved around the edge of the module rather than straight across, which felt like a choice rather than a path, and she came to stand beside me while I opened the second container. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth off her, a dry, dense warmth different from the recycled air of the ship. She smelled of the module bedding and something faintly mineral like stone that has been sitting in sun. She put her nose against my hand once, briefly, and then went to eat. I wrote in my personal log that night that I thought things were going adequately. Transit day 9. I arrived, and both of them were at the door. I want to describe something about the routine that I think is relevant, because it came up later in the formal review, and I want to be accurate about when it started and why. I have a habit I developed after my wife died, which is that when I sit down to eat, I set out 2 servings before my own. My wife used to do that, set out the children's plates before hers, and after she was gone, I kept doing it for the children. And after the children grew up and left, I kept doing it anyway because by then it was just the way I ate. 2 portions down, then mine. It is not something I decided to do. It is something my hands do. When I was eating in the crew mess, I did the same thing. I set 2 small portions of whatever I was having into separate containers before I served my own plate. I usually didn't eat the extra portions. I left them at the end of the table. The crew thought this was a quirk, and I didn't explain it. Sethran had once asked me about it early in the run, and I'd told her it was an old habit. And she had looked at me in the way people look when they've understood something they didn't ask to understand, and neither of us had mentioned it again. On transit day 9, I was eating in the mess when Cor appeared. She should not have been able to appear. The module was sealed. The module override required my certification code, which I had been assigned after transit day 6, and Cor did not have my certification code. What she had, apparently, was 6 inches of dew claw and 400 pounds of leverage and the patience to apply both to the locking mechanism over the course of an hour or so until something gave. Dunphy's notes, I later found, had a small annotation at the very end that read, "Note juveniles can defeat standard livestock module locks at approximately 26 months. This annotation was on the last page. I had not reached the last page on my first read. She came into the crew mess at mealtime, walked to my table, sat down next to me and waited. I looked at her. I looked at the 2 extra portions I had set out before my own plate. I thought about this for a moment. Then I pushed the nearest container toward her. She ate it. Neath came through the mess door about 90 seconds later. She is, as I said, more deliberate, and sat on my other side, and I pushed the second container toward her, and she ate that. I ate my own meal. They sat on either side of me and waited, and when I was done, they followed me back to the aft module, and I locked the door again. And they sat on the other side of it making the contact call for a few minutes before they settled. Cargo Supervisor Ossel was in the mess when this happened. He was standing at the service counter with his tray, and he did not move for the duration of the meal. When I left with a Sorath, he was still standing there. I nodded to him. He didn't respond. He filed a complaint with Captain Solarn that afternoon. I was called to her office and asked to describe what had happened. I described what had happened. She listened in her complete way and then said 2 things. She said, "Contain the module breach," and she said, "Keep feeding them." I reinforced the lock mechanism on transit day 10. Cor defeated it by transit day 12. I stopped reinforcing it. On transit day 11, the ship's veterinary officer, Sethran, asked to accompany me on a feeding. She had certification in large fauna monitoring and was technically the most qualified person on the ship to be doing what I was doing, and she had been, by her own account, trying to get near the Sorath since Dunv died and not succeeding. They wouldn't let her in. They moved to the back of the module and stayed there, watching her with the flat, patient attention of animals deciding whether something is a threat. She had tried 3 times. She came with me on transit day 11 and stood near the door while I did the feeding. Neath acknowledged her from a distance, nose to the air, no movement. Kor ignored her entirely. Sethran stood very still and watched, and when we left she said quietly that she'd never seen juveniles imprint this fast. I said I didn't think it was an imprint exactly. She looked at me. I said I thought they just liked the routine. She said that was what imprinting was. We had this conversation several more times over the following weeks, always arriving at the same place. I don't think she was wrong. I think I was not quite ready to use the word. On transit day 13, the situation changed in a way that required the meal seating to be formalized. I say formalized. What I mean is that the crew adapted to it. Kor and Neath had taken to treating the crew mess as a shared space during my meal. Times, and after the first 2 days of considerable disruption, several crew members elected to take their meals in their quarters during the Sorath hour, which Captain Solarn permitted but did not encourage. Most of the remaining crew had settled into a kind of pragmatic coexistence. They ate on their side of the mess. I sat at my usual table, and the Sorath sat flanking me and ate what I set out for them. I want to describe what this looked like from the outside, because Sethran described it to me later, and her description was more precise than mine. Would have been since I was in the middle of it, she said. From the corridor door, it looked like a man eating a quiet meal at a table with 2 very large cats sitting on either side of him, and the rest of the crew eating their meals somewhat more carefully than usual on the other side of the room. She said the interesting thing was how quickly normal it became. The first 3 days the mess went quiet when I walked in with the Sorath. By transit day 16, people were talking around us the same way they talked around any other table. Ensign Tarath, the youngest crew member on the barge, began sitting at the far end of my table on transit day 14. He didn't ask permission. He just sat there with his tray. Neath looked at him for a long moment. Kor ignored him. He ate his meal. Nothing happened. He came back the next day. By transit day 17, there were 4 regulars at my end of the table, and the Sorath were accustomed to all of them, though Kor kept at Tarath on extended review for most of the run. She would sit near him and watch him eat with the particular attention of an animal that has not fully made up its mind. He handled this with remarkable composure for a 23-year-old. He told me once that he'd grown up on a frontier ranch and was used to being watched while he ate. I believed him. On transit day 16, Kor had investigated his tray. Not aggressively. She had simply leaned over and put her nose to it while he was looking in the other direction, and when he turned back and found 400 pounds of juvenile Sorath approximately 6 inches from his meal, he had gone very still in the way that I had learned meant he was thinking quickly. He said carefully that she was welcome to smell it, but it was his. Kor had looked at him for a moment. Then she had gone back to her side and sat down. Tarath had looked at me. I had told him that I thought he had passed. He had exhaled with considerable feeling. The other 3 regulars were Sethran, a cargo tech named Marif, and the ship's navigator Pol Esteron, who ate quickly and left early and never said much, but who seemed, in her efficient way, to have decided that the Sorath arrangement was a reasonable use of the available space. Neath appeared to have reached the same conclusion about her. Neath, during this same period, developed the habit of sleeping outside my cabin door. I would like to be precise about this. She did not scratch or ask. She simply appeared one night. I could hear her breathing through the door panel, and in the morning when I opened it, she was there, lying across the threshold with her quills flat and her eyes half closed. She got up when I came out and walked with me to the mess. This continued every night from transit day 14 onward. I did not invite it. I also did not discourage it. The corridor outside my cabin is slightly warmer than the rest of that deck because of the thermal exchange unit behind the panel, and I assumed for the first 3 days that she was simply attracted to the warmth. Sethran told me later that Sorath don't particularly seek warmth. They are thermoregulatory generalists. They sleep in corridors because they are guarding the corridor. I thought about that for a while and kept moving. On transit day 15, something happened in the mess that I did not document in my personal log because at the time I did not know it was significant. but which the species consultant later asked me about specifically. I had a headache that day. Not serious, just the kind that comes from too many hours under the cargo deck lighting, which has an uneven flicker in the aft section that I had logged as a maintenance item on transit day 7, and which had not been addressed. I was eating slowly and not very much. I set out the 2 portions before my own as I always did, but I ate less of mine and pushed my plate away early. Cor finished her portion and looked at mine. I told her it wasn't hers, which was the kind of thing I found myself saying to her because she seemed to attend to tone rather than vocabulary. She looked at me for a moment. Then she put her head down on the table edge, chin resting on the surface about 8 inches from my plate, and stayed there. She did not eat from my plate. She just rested there, that enormous head close to my arm, and her quills stayed flat, and her eyes were half closed. Naeth ate her portion, and then came around the table, and lay down against the bench along my side, her full weight against my legs. The bench is fixed to the wall, so there was nowhere for me to go, and I sat there with Cor's chin on the table next to my elbow and 400 pounds of Naeth pressing warm against my legs, and after a few minutes the headache was better. Whether this was the warmth or the company, or just time passing, I cannot say, but it was better. The species consultant, when I described this, said it was an extremely specific Sorath comfort behavior performed by bonded animals for a pack member they have assessed as unwell. She said it was also the behavior they performed at the nest for recently injured hunt companions. She asked me how I had felt in the moment. I told her I had felt, if I was honest, like someone was taking care of me. She said, yes, that is what they were doing. On transit day 17, I reached Paris Dunphy's notes again. I read them more carefully this time. The section on imprinting protocols was long and technical, and I will not reproduce all of it here, but the essential point was this. Sorath forms social bonds in a way that is simultaneously cognitive and instinctive, meaning the bond is not simply a learned behavior, but reflects an actual shift in how the animal categorizes the bonded individual. A bonded individual is no longer categorized as external. They are pack. The protocol notes specified that this shift is, in Sorath social architecture, essentially irreversible under normal conditions. The notes said that attempting to physically separate a bonded juvenile from its anchor, particularly during the active bonding phase, would trigger significant stress responses and potentially defensive aggression toward anyone perceived as enforcing the separation. The notes did not say what to do about a cargo supervisor who had been filing daily complaints asking for exactly that. I flagged the relevant sections and forwarded them to Captain Solarn. She thanked me and filed them. Ossel filed 2 more complaints and then, on transit day 19, took direct action. I was in the lower cargo deck that morning, the actual cargo, not the livestock module, the stacked crates and sealed containers that are the majority of what I spend my time with. The lower deck is poorly lit, particularly in the aft sections, and I was doing a physical verification of a manifest discrepancy that had been bothering me for 3 days. Standard work. I had my scanner and my clipboard, and the particular focused quiet I get when I'm looking for a number that doesn't match. I was aware, in the abstract way you are aware of things on a ship you've been aboard for 3 weeks, that Ossal had requisitioned 2 contractors for a shift starting that morning, and that he'd logged them as structural maintenance. This was not unusual. I had not looked at the maintenance dockets closely. I should have. He came into the lower cargo deck at approximately 072 mo with the 2 contractors behind him. I heard them before I saw them, but only barely. Ossel moved quietly when he wanted to, a quality I had not previously had occasion to notice. I turned around when they were about 8 feet away. He told me he was reallocating the Sorath module to cold storage. He told me the animals were going to be sedated with the emergency kit supplies and crated for the remainder of the run. He told me that my manifest risk role had been reviewed, and that the unauthorized handling and welfare decisions I had been making were outside my certification and constituted a liability for the ship, and he was correcting the situation. He told me the contractors were there for compliance. I looked at the contractors. They were larger than me, which is not a difficult standard to meet. One of them was holding a restraint kit. I recognized it from Dunphy's emergency supplies. It was one of the items I had logged on transit day 6 and left in the aft module storage locker. He had gone into the module to retrieve it. I thought about what that meant. That he'd gone into the module and come back with the equipment, and the Sorath had been in there, and he'd come back with the equipment and no other notable report. And then I realized that the Sorath hadn't been In there, the lower deck is adjacent to the aft livestock corridor. I had been in the lower deck for 40 minutes. Cor and Naeth had been with me for 35 of them, in the aft section where the lighting was poorest, lying between two pallet stacks while I worked. I had not thought to mention this to anyone because it was routine by Transit Day 19. They followed me on morning rounds the same way they came to the mess at mealtimes. I had stopped noting it as unusual because it wasn't unusual anymore. I did not have time to finish the thought. There is a particular sound a Sorath makes that Dun's notes described as a convergence call. It is not loud. It is almost the opposite of loud. It is a dense, low-frequency resonance that you feel more than hear. A kind of sound that makes the fluid in your inner ear take notice, that makes your shoulders want to draw inward without any particular reason you can name. He noted that this call is used between bonded juveniles to coordinate approach, and that it typically precedes group action. It is a sound that means, I am here and you are there, and we have a shared purpose and we are moving. It came from the aft section of the lower deck, where the lighting was poorest and the pallet stacks stood tallest. All three of them heard it. The contractor with the restraint kit turned toward the sound and stopped turning. He stopped mid-motion, weight on one foot, and stayed there as though completing the turn required information he didn't have yet. Cor came out of the dark first. She came low and quiet, the way cats move when they are being deliberate, and she came to stand between me and the contractors. Her quills were up, all of them, the full ruff standing erect from skull to mid-back, which I had not seen before, and which made her look considerably larger than she ordinarily did. The ruff up does something to the silhouette that is hard to describe accurately. It changes the shape. She looked like a different animal than the one that put her chin on the table next to my elbow the previous Tuesday. And both things were completely true at the same time. Her dew claws were partially extended. She was not making any sound at all. The silence was, if anything, worse than the convergence call had been. Naeth came out of the dark behind Ossel. She did not rush. She emerged from the shadows the same way she always moved, settled, deliberate. Each step placed rather than taken, and she came to stand behind him, close enough that he would have felt her breath on the back of his neck. And she was also silent, and her quills were also up, and she was looking at the contractor with the restraint kit with a focused, patient attention that I recognized from watching her assess Tarath in the mess for 10 days. She had given Tarath the same look. Tarath had passed. The contractor did not look like he was going to pass. None of them moved for a long moment. Then Cor took toward the contractor with the restraint kit. One step. Not fast, not threatening in any overt way, just a step. The kind of step that repositions the geometry of the situation. The contractor took 2 steps backward, and the restraint kit hit the deck with the sound of polymer casing on metal grating. I want to be accurate about this. The second contractor was no longer in the corridor behind Ossal. I did not see him leave. I am not certain exactly when he left. He was simply no longer there, I should say clearly. Neither Sorath harmed anyone. There was no blood. There was no physical contact between the Sorath and any person other than me. I want this to be part of the formal record because I believe it is relevant to how the Sorath were behaving. They were not attacking. They were positioning. There is a difference, and I think it matters, and I think it speaks to exactly what Dunviz's notes said about bonded juveniles and defensive behavior. They had made an assessment. They had taken the minimum necessary action. They were done when the situation was resolved. Ossel said very quietly that this was not over. Naeth turned her head and looked at him. He stopped talking. I want to be accurate about that too. He stopped mid-word, which suggests that she turned at exactly the right moment, and that, looking at her in that moment, close behind him with her quills up and her eyes fully on him, was sufficient to complete the thought on his behalf. I picked up the restraint kit, I said, also quietly, that I was going to go back to my manifest work, and that I would appreciate it if everyone went back to what they were doing. I said this because it was what I would have said in any work situation that had reached an impasse. It was not a speech. I am not a speech person. I just said it. Ossel and the first contractor left. They went up the forward corridor rather than the aft corridor, which I noted. Nathath followed me back to my scanner and clipboard, and lay down next to the crate stack while I finished the verification. Cor patrolled the perimeter of the lower deck in a loose circuit for about 20 minutes. She made 4 complete passes, and then came to lie on my other side. She did not stop making the convergence call sound for the first 3 circuits. By the 4th, she had stopped, and her quills were down. and she was simply a large amber-striped animal lying on cargo deck, plating next to a man with a scanner and a clipboard. I found the manifest discrepancy. It was a transponder code error on a sealed unit from Tessavar. Nothing significant. I corrected it, logged it, and went back up to my cabin. I filed an incident report. Captain Solarn called me to her office within the hour. She told me that Asal had already filed his own incident report, and that his version described an unauthorized animal attack. She said this with the tone she used for things she had already decided how to handle. I told her that no one had been touched, and offered to provide documentation of the Sorath behavioral notes supporting that distinction. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Salm, do you know what the Tarath envoys do to a vessel that delivers injured treaty animals?" I said I had some idea. She said, "And do you know what they do to a vessel that delivers treaty animals in good health, properly bonded, ahead of schedule?" I said I didn't know the specifics. She said she would tell me after we docked. She said to keep feeding the Sorath, and to file all subsequent Asal interactions through her directly. She said Asal was confined to his quarters for the remainder of the run pending a formal review. She said this last part in a tone that suggested the review's conclusion was not in significant doubt. I thanked her and went back to my cabin. Naeth was already there. The remaining 12 days of the run were by comparison quiet. I am aware that quiet is a relative term on a vessel where two large alien predators have effectively reorganized the social structure of the crew. Mess, but there were no further incidents of the kind I have described. Asal remained in his quarters. He sent 2 relay messages to his company's regional office that I was not permitted to read, but which Captain Solarn later summarized as containing several claims that she described as creative. His 2 contractors were visibly careful in any space where I might be present, which I did not find unpleasant. The crew adapted further. By Transit Day 24, Ensign Tarath had taught Cora a hand signal for sit that she responded to about 60% of the time, which he was unreasonably proud of. He was attempting, when I last spoke with him about it, to develop a second signal. I wished him luck. By Transit Day 27, Naeth had started following Sethran on her rounds when I was doing manifest work in the forward sections, which Sethran received with the composure of someone trying very hard not to appear moved. I asked Sethran once how it felt to walk the ship with Naeth behind her. She said it felt like having a very serious, very quiet colleague who happened to be the size of a piece of furniture. She said she had started talking to Naeth on rounds. She said Naeth was a good listener. I want to describe something that happened on Transit Day 23, which is relevant to the formal review and which I want to document with precision. I received a relay communication from a Sorath species consultant named Ven Ardath, stationed at Tarath Station, who had been briefed on our situation by Captain Solarn. The communication was flagged urgent and came in during the middle watch, which meant I was half asleep when I answered it, and probably sounded like it. She asked me to discuss, in as much detail as possible, the primary routine that the juveniles had attached to. I described the meal routine, the 2 bowls set out before my own, the timing and the placement, the way Cor had come into the mess that first time, and side the portions as though she'd been told to expect them, the way the routine had established itself across 3 weeks, consistent at every meal, both of them present, both portions set before mine, the same sequence every time. There was a long silence on the relay. She asked me to repeat the description. I repeated it. Another silence. It was long enough that I asked whether the connection was still active. She said the connection was active. She said she was thinking. She asked whether I was aware of the Sorath pre-hunt feeding protocol in their native cultural framework. I said I was not. She said that in traditional Sorath pack social structure, the ranking member of a hunting group performs what translates approximately as a first feeding invocation before any major hunt, a ritual presentation of 2 symbolic portions offered outward before the presenter eats, as a gesture of communal provision and acknowledgement of the pack's shared stake in the coming effort. She said this ritual is performed by the pack's anchor, the individual the group orients around. She said it is one of the clearest and most unambiguous social signals in Sorath cultural behavior. She said it was taught to Sorath cubs at a very early age, and that the juveniles in the active bonding phase would be particularly attuned to it. She asked me how I had known to do it. I told her I hadn't known. I told her about my wife. I told her about the children and the table, and the 16 years of a small domestic habit carried through every posting and every bunk and every mess hall on every ship I had ever worked. I told her that my hands had done it because my hands had been doing it for years, because Lena had done it that way and I had never stopped. She was quiet for a long time after that. She said, "Mr. Solm, I have been studying Sorath for 11 years. What you have accidentally done is perform an unimpeachable declaration of pack anchor status, consistently and correctly twice a day for 3 weeks." She paused. She said, "The juveniles didn't choose you. In their framework, you chose them first." I thought about this for quite a while, I said. So they responded to a grief ritual the same way they'd respond to a hunting. Invocation, she said. The structure is identical, 2 portions outward, pack acknowledge before self. It doesn't matter to the Sorath what story is behind the gesture. The gesture is the gesture. I said I was going to need a few minutes. She said she understood. I sat in my cabin for a while and thought about my wife and my children, and the small domestic habit that had traveled with me for 16 years and how it had found its way to the lower corridor of a mid-haul cargo barge in the Tarath transit lane and been recognized. Precisely recognized, by 2 amber-striped alien juveniles who had been looking for a pack and found one in a manifest clerk with a worn jacket and a grief habit and no credentials at all. Naeth was lying outside my door. I could hear her breathing. I opened the door and sat on the threshold for a while, and she put her head in my lap and I sat there with my hand on her quill ruff and didn't say anything for a long time. The corridor lighting hummed. The ship moved through the Tarath Corridor with the steady, indifferent efficiency of a vessel on schedule. Naeth breathed in and out and her quills stayed flat under my hand. After a while I went back to sleep. That is the part of the incident report that is hardest to write as a formal document. I have written it as accurately as I can. Formal review conducted later found that the first portion right, as it came to be designated in the Sorath diplomatic correspondence. The species consultant used that phrase in her official report to the Assembly, and it was entered into the formal record, constituted a recognized social bonding protocol under Sorath traditional law, and that the individuals who had performed it and received it were, in the Assembly's determination, in a state of recognized pack relationship. The review noted, with what I thought was admirable composure, that this was the first documented instance of a non-Sorath individual accidentally satisfying the criteria for pack anchor recognition under traditional Sorath social law, and that the jurisprudential implications for the Corridor Treaty were being assessed by a specialist committee. I did not follow the jurisprudential implications closely. I had manifest work. We arrived at Tarath Station on Transit Day 31, 17 minutes ahead of schedule, because Captain Solarn had made up time in the Tarath Corridor in a way that I chose not to examine too carefully. The station approach was clean. The docking was standard. The docking smelled of the particular mix of outgassing and recycled station air that all large transit stations smell like. A smell I have never been able to describe as pleasant, but that means arrival, which is its own quality. The Sorath diplomatic envoys came aboard at 1100 station time. I want to describe this because I think it completes the record, and because the formal review asked me to account for all relevant interactions. There were 4 of them, the envoys. I had seen representations of adult Sorath in Dunvee's notes and in the species documentation Sethran had shared with me during the run, but representations do not fully convey the experience of standing in a cargo bay, while 4 of them walk through the loading door. Adult Sorath are considerably larger than juveniles. They move differently too, where Naeth and Kor moved with the looseness of young animals still. Calibrating their bodies, the adults moved with a settled, deliberate weight that made the docking bay feel smaller each step they took. They wore formal harness, ceremonial by the look of it, tooled in dark leather with metal fittings that caught the bay lighting and held it, and the senior envoy had a rank marking across the brow ridge in a deep copper pigment that I did not know how to read but that carried the quality of something that had been earned and kept for a long time. The 4 of them entered the bay and paused. Captain Solarn was there with her full available complement. Sethran was there in her best uniform, which I had not previously seen and which suited her. There were 6 officers in a line along the bay floor, full dress. The station's diplomatic liaison was present with 2 aides. It was a proper receiving arrangement. The envoys walked past all of them. I should clarify. They did not ignore the formal arrangement. The senior envoy made a brief acknowledgement gesture toward Captain Solarn as it passed. A slight forward tilt of the head, the kind that registered without slowing, and the captain received it without expression, which I later understood she had been briefed to do. They knew who was in the bay. They were going somewhere specific. I was standing near the aft access door in my work jacket, which has a pocket for my scanner and a tier along the left cuff from a cargo hook. Incident on Transit Day 22. I had not dressed for the occasion because no one had told me I was part of the occasion. I had come to make sure the manifest transfer documents were in order. I had my clipboard. I had my scanner on my belt. I was standing slightly apart from the formal arrangement because I was not part of the formal arrangement. The senior envoy stopped in front of me. Kor and Neath were beside me. They had been beside me since the envoys came through the door, flanking, quills flat, watching the newcomers with the intense stillness of animals who are not alarmed but are paying attention to everything. When the senior envoy stopped, both of them turned slightly outward, as though positioning, and then settled. It was the same positioning they had used in the lower cargo deck on Transit Day 19. It meant something. I understood it differently this time. The senior envoy was approximately 6 feet at the shoulder. Looking up at that face is not an experience I had been prepared for, and I had been living with the juveniles for 3 weeks. The amber gold eyes with the cobalt ring are the same at any age, that distinctive, luminescent quality. The way the ring holds light as though it runs through the structure, rather than sitting on the surface, and they were larger, and there was considerably more behind them. A depth that juveniles don't have yet. Something that had been somewhere and come back. The envoy lowered its head. Not a small movement, a sustained, deliberate downward arc. Head brought below the line of the shoulder and held there for a full count of 3 or 4 seconds. A long time in that bay, with everyone watching. I knew the gesture from Dunn's notes. I had read the description. Seeing it in a cargo bay at Tarath Station, while standing in a jacket with a torn cuff, is a different experience than reading about it. The other 3 envoys did the same, a single beat after the senior, in the way that a formal acknowledgement of any kind moves through a group. One voice and then the others, the same word. Neath made a sound, a long, low resonance. The warm contact call and Kor matched it immediately. The bay was large and the sound carried. Captain Solarn told me later, over a cup of something warm in her office after the envoys had moved to the station for formal meetings, that the lowered head, sustained, with the escort matching, is offered by adult Sorath exclusively to recognized pack anchors, and that the duration of the hold is an index of the formality of the recognition. She said the species consultant Ardith had briefed her on this before docking. She said she had positioned the crew the way she did, formal arrangement along one side of the bay, so that, when the envoys walked past the officers and stopped at the manifest clerk, everyone in the bay would understand what they were seeing without being told. She said Ardath had also told her that the appropriate response to the presentation gesture was an acknowledgement of communal provision. Some reference to the shared meal, the act of feeding, anything in that register. I had not been told this. At the time I knew only that 4 very large Sorath had just lowered their heads at me in my work jacket, and Neath and Kor were making the sound they made when everything was all right. I said the only thing I could think to say, which was, I just fed them. Solarn told me that Ardith had been in the bay, that she had heard what I said, that she had stepped outside afterward, and Solarn had given her a few minutes because she was a professional, and professionals are permitted a few minutes. The species consultant Ardath, who was present at the review 6 days later, and who had by that point spoken with me at some length about Sorath cultural practice, told me that my response had been, her word, apt. She said that in Sorath social framing, the acknowledgement of a shared meal is the appropriate reciprocal response to the presentation gesture. She said that I had, without knowing it, completed the formal recognition exchange correctly. I told her I had not known it. She said, yes, that is perhaps why it worked. The Sorath envoys held a formal meeting with Captain Solarn and the station administrators for the better part of the afternoon. I sat in for part of it because Ardith asked me to. The topic, as far as I understood it, concerned the diplomatic status of the bonded relationship, the question of whether Neath and Kor would continue the original journey to the exchange ceremony, or whether the existence of a recognized pack anchor relationship changed the calculus, and various jurisdictional questions that I followed poorly, but Ardith seemed to find fascinating in the way specialists find the unexpected applications of their expertise fascinating, not pleased by the complication exactly, but interested by it. I asked during a break in the proceedings what the options were for the juveniles. Ardith said there were essentially 2. The envoys could invoke traditional law, and request that the pack anchor accompany the juveniles to the exchange venue for a transitional period, the length of which the assembly was debating, but which would be at least 3 months, after which the bond would be formally acknowledged and the anchor's obligations fulfilled, the juveniles integrated into their new assignment with the recognition intact. Or they could request an exception to the traditional framework and proceed with the original exchange, accepting some disruption to the juvenile's social integration for the duration. She said the second option was not, in the Assembly's view, particularly appealing given the circumstances. She said that a pair of juveniles who had completed a pack anchor bond and then had that anchor removed abruptly were going to be, in her technical assessment, difficult. She used a longer and more precise term in Sorath that she then translated as difficult, and then said that difficult was a significant understatement. I asked which option the envoys preferred. She asked me which option I preferred. I thought about my manifest work. I thought about the next posting I had been scheduled for, which was a dry goods transfer run in the Vethus sector. 6 weeks, nothing notable. I thought about my cabin on the Orindal Reach in Neath outside the door each morning, and the weight of her head in my lap on the corridor threshold. I thought about Cor sitting beside me in the mess and eating what I set out for her, and the sound they both made when everything was all right, and how I had not heard that sound and thought about Lena in the same moment, until 3 weeks on a mid-haul barge had taught me that a grief habit is not always only grief. I said I'd need to clear a leave request with Captain Solarn. Ardath smiled. She said she thought the captain would approve it. She was right. This incident report covers the period from Transit Day 19 through Transit Day 31, as specified in the review request. The events before Transit Day 19 are documented in my personal log, which I have appended to this report in full, as requested by the review board. I want to add one thing that is not, strictly speaking, part of the incident record, but which the review board chair told me I was permitted to include. My wife's name was Lena. She died 9 years ago. She was the one who started the habit, as I said, 2 portions down before hers, every time, without fail. She said it was how you showed people they were thought of before you thought of yourself. She said that was what family meant, the small regular acts that said, I was thinking of you when I woke up, before I thought of what I needed. I have carried that habit to 11 ships over 9 years, and it has never been anything except a private sorrow and a way of getting through a meal. I do not know what Lena would have said about Neath and Cor. I have thought about it. I think she would have said that gestures travel. I think she would have said that the universe keeps better records than we do. I think she would have liked them. The deliberate patience of Neath, the forward certainty of Cor, the sound they make in the dark when they know where you are and everything is all right. I think she would have said. Of course they knew. That's the whole point. The report ends here. Filed Rivik Solm, Cargo Manifest Specialist, Grade 3 Vessel. Orindal Reach. CTV Sevastation Receiving Stamp, Transit Day 31 Pluxeem.